Welcome back to the Ladakh Literature Festival 2020. Our session for today is Into the Heart of the Himalayas, a one-on-one discussion between Tony Wheeler and Jono Lineen. After the untimely death of his brother, Jono Lineen undertook a 2,700-kilometer solo trek across the Himalayas, crossing Pakistan and India, including around 8 years in Ladakh. Today he speaks about his book, Into the Heart of the Himalayas, and his time in Ladakh. Tony Wheeler is the founder of Lonely Planet and the Planet Wheeler Foundation.
You met a lot of people on it. I mean, I was just surprised how many people you drop into this village and there was somebody you knew there from a previous walk. I mean, I meet anybody walking, you meet lots of people, but most of them you're there for maybe that coffee, that stove fixing thing with the French mountaineer, and then you never see them again.
Yeah.
Bump into people, oh, we spent time together, I met your wife, you've got more children now, you know.
Well, I should say that mainly happened in Ladakh and Zanskar and into Lahore and Spiti, because I'd spent so much time there. You know, during the 1990s, I was living in Ladakh on and off for about 8 years. So I knew people, and for a lot of that time I was walking. I mean, you know me, Tony. I'm obsessive about walking. I love walking, and one of the things about walking, and especially on that walk, when you're walking alone, you are completely open. You're completely open to the environment. You're completely open to the people around you. You're completely open to these new experiences. And so I would say that, prior to that very long walk, I met lots of people, and maybe I made an impression on them because a lot of the time I did walk alone. And I'm also a very inquisitive person. I like to ask questions, and one question always leads to another one. And anytime you ask someone a question, especially when you're asking it with respect and consideration, people feel empowered by that, because all of a sudden you're an expert with the knowledge. And pretty well everybody that I met on those many walks that I made around Ladakh and Zanskar, they were the experts. I was the neophyte. I was the one who was learning. And so people were really open to me. And maybe that's people remembered that when I came back. Here's the guy who wanted to learn something. And they didn't really care if I was on this extremely long walk. This was just another one of Jono's walks. It was interesting, when I met people, for example, like military officers. Military officers were very interested in where I'd been, where I was going, the logistics of the trek, how I had gotten here, what kind of equipment I was using, all of that stuff, because that's part of their job. But for everyday people in the village, as Zanskari isn't all that interested in my equipment. They're interested in me as a person. Why is this person showing up in the village all alone, on their own? And when you show up in a village alone, especially if you're some white guy from a very, very distant place showing up in a village in the high Himalaya, you become the target of a lot of compassion and generosity, which is fantastic. People felt that they had to look after me in some way. So I would show up in a village and I would sit down on somebody's doorstep just to have some water. And within 5 minutes, people would be around me asking questions and, poking at me and ultimately offering me a cup of tea. And after 10 minutes, people would be offering me a place to stay. An important thing to keep in mind is that probably for only half of the time that I was on that very long walk, I was actually sleeping in my tent. The other half of the time, I was staying generally in people's houses. and I can't remember a single time when I, asked someone for a place to stay. I was always offered that place to stay because people felt that they had to look after me. It was really, that was very, very special, um, Tony, because as you know, I mean, the real catalyst for this walk was the death of my younger brother. And when my younger brother died, in tragic, it was a tragic situation in Canada. He'd gone to train with his rowing team at the University of Victoria. A huge storm had come out of the Pacific and created these 6-foot waves on this very small lake that
It
they were.
was a small lake. That's what amazed me. You said it was a kilometer wide and 2 kilometers long or
Yeah.
something.
Oh yeah, yeah. You could walk around it in an hour. Less than an hour. But there was 6-foot waves on this lake, and they couldn't see the shore, and it was very cold. It was winter time in Canada, so the water was 2 to 3 degrees, and he eventually died of hypothermia. And when
Were there
some,
survivors from the rowing team?
pardon me,
Were there survivors? The other
yes,
row?
actually only 2 of the lads died, and the other, so there was 2 eight-man crews with coxes, so there was 18 people there, and 16 of them survived. And Gareth didn't make it, and it was an incredibly emotional and depressing time for me, because when something like that happens, you lose faith, and I lost faith in the future in a lot of ways, because all of a sudden you realize that mortality is there right on your doorstep all the time. And I lost faith in humanity, because my brother didn't survive, and all these other lads did survive. So who was looking after him?
Yeah.
And in a way, I lost faith in myself, and that led to really 2 years of a pretty bad downward spiral. A lot of booze and a lot of drugs and failed relationships. And I was very fortunate. Of course, I was extremely fortunate to have a fantastic family who supported me through that, especially my mom supported me through that. And it was actually a memory of my mom that eventually brought me to Ladakh, because when we were kids, and as you know from the book, I grew up in Belfast in Northern Ireland.
You used to walk every night.
What
Was it
we used
before or after dinner? I forget.
Yeah. We used to walk all the time. My mom loved walking. And on Saturdays, we would walk down to the library, and we'd choose our books for the week. And I would always choose a couple of kids' mysteries. And then I would be drawn over to the mountaineering section. And you remember that from Britain in the 70s. Mountaineering books were a big thing. Doug Scott and Dougal Haston and Chris Bonington and all these guys, had these books. And I remember going there and looking through these books, and all of them had that insert of color photos in the center. And I would
Yes.
look at those photos, and there would be these men and women in these bright colored down jackets way up in the Himalayas with, titanium snow all around, and beautiful depthless blue skies, and peaks after peaks after peaks flowing out behind them. And when I think about it now, I realize, of course, that image was an image of freedom. It was an image of striving for this goal that, a difficult goal that was achievable if you worked towards it. And that idea and that image, the clarity around that image was so completely different than Belfast in the 1970s, because it was all gray. It was the Victorian architecture and the gray sky and the khaki uniforms on the street. All of this stuff was completely opposite to the Himalayas. And so when I was a kid, like a tiny kid, I wanted to go to the Himalayas. And it was only after Gareth died, and I kind of hit the bottom of that downward spiral, that I thought, okay, well, now I got to go. And I'll never forget, taking the bus from Srinagar up to Leh. And of course, when you get into Leh, you come in past the airport and all the military camps. And I've been just fascinated by this landscape because it's a high altitude desert. Ladakh is so beautiful and so completely different than anything else I had ever experienced, because I grew up in rainforests, either in the west coast of Canada or in the rain of Ireland. Here was a place that was a high altitude desert, and I was just fascinated by this and by the light in Ladakh. It's like crystal light. Everything is defined in a particular way, with a particular exactitude that you don't find in Vancouver or Belfast, because it's constantly hazed out by the humidity.
Yeah.
And I remember coming.
I think, in a place like Ladakh, you come away from it if you take photographs and you think, hey, I'm a really good photographer. And it's
Yes,
same in the Antarctic. The Antarctic does the same thing. It flatters amateurs with cameras.
yes, yes.
Yeah, I've only been to Ladakh once, a long time ago, but I do remember, as you say, that crystal clarity of everything.
Oh,
Every just like that.
oh, it really stayed with me, And when we came into Leh, and you would have experienced it if you'd flown up there from Delhi. You come in from lower down in the valley. You pass all these military camps, and I was thinking, oh, this isn't quite the image that I had in mind, because there's a lot of military in Ladakh. But then slowly, you climb up the hill towards the castle, and the Gompa up on top of the hill behind the town, and was kind of, it's like a miniature Lhasa. And I was thinking, oh wow, this is what I expected.
Yeah.
And I remember getting off that bus and walking with a copy of my Lonely Planet guide, needless to say, and find a guest house called the Deluxe Guest House. And the woman that I still call Amelie was running the guest house. Now, of course, they have a fancy hotel there, but the guest house, the old guest house, is still behind there, and I still consider her my Amelie. And she took me in, and she made me tuppa, and her son Delex, he's still a friend of mine, and we, I've found my second home there. And what was so homely about it was the people. The landscape and the topography were completely alien to me, but the people in Ladakh and in Zanskar were and are the most compassionate, most generous people that I've ever met. And I went there for a season of walking, and I ended up spending 8 years. And that says a lot about the people of Ladakh right there. And getting back to my original point, I had lost faith in the future, in humanity, in myself. And I always say that it was the people of Ladakh who reinstilled my faith in humanity. And they were the ones, you got to have faith in humanity to undertake a 2,700 kilometer walk. So I have to.
Your walk was the 2,700 kilometers. Wow.
Yeah, 2,700 kilometers. Yeah.
God, that's longer than I thought. And how long did it take again?
About 4.5 months.
4.5 months.
So, it's I got to put it into context though, Tony, because at that point in time, I was an incredibly fit young guy. In my early 30s, I had been an international caliber cross-country ski racer until my mid-20s, and I'd raced in the World Championships and in the World Cup. So I was in incredibly good shape. And so for me, and of course, by the time I undertook that very long walk, I'd been living on and off at altitude for years. So I was fully acclimatized. And it was not a problem for me to walk 30 to 40 kilometers every day with that
With that,
25 with that pack, and over 5,000-meter passes. I'd
yeah,
never had any physical issues in the entire time, any time that I was walking the dog. So, of course, when I think about it now, 2,700 kilometers through the high Himalaya at altitude, I think, wow, that is crazy. But at the time, it didn't even faze me. There were actually days when I walked 70 kilometers.
wow.
Yeah.
Did you ever think of sort of going back and carrying on, following the Himalaya through Nepal, and doing the entire Himalaya from one end to the other?
I did, but I was so fortunate in that, logistically, I think the walk was easier to organize in India and in Pakistan compared to Nepal, and especially Bhutan or in the northeast. Once you cross the Mahakali River into Nepal, it is much more difficult. Well, it was then. Of course, now you have the Great Himalayan Trail, and people are walking that route every year. But this was in the mid '90s, and there was almost no infrastructure in those parts of Nepal. And friends that actually warned me, if you get into Nepal at certain times of the year, there is not going to be any food because people harvest their rice or harvest their barley, and it's enough rice to see them through until the next harvest, and there's nothing spare. So yes, I could have relied on people's incredible generosity at that point, but I didn't want to do it. And I should also say that when I got to the border of Nepal, I really did feel that something had changed in me. I didn't know what. It's important to point out to people that when I undertook this trek, when I started this trek, my thought around it was that, I'm doing this to be the first guy to walk the length of the Western Himalayas alone. I want to be like Doug Scott and Dougal Haston and Chris Bonington. I want to be like those guys. But this walk was quite different than anything they did, because this walk, again, being a man alone in the Himalayas, was very different than what they did with their teams climbing really technical routes on high mountains. So much of my experience was about interacting with the people. And as I said, that interaction with the people really changed me over the years that I was there, but especially on that walk, because it was that experience of the compassion and wisdom of the people of the Himalayas was intensified over that experience, because again, I was completely reliant on them in so many ways. And when I reached the Mahakali River, when I reached Nepal eventually, it was like, okay, this feels right now. This feels right to stop and try and understand what has happened to me. And of course, that point then, that really was the second journey. The first journey really was the completion of that 2,700 kilometer trek. But the second journey of this book was the actual writing of it, which took me 12 years.
And going on to that, um, I'm amazed how detailed a lot of your description was. I mean, did you take lots of notes or lots of photographs? I mean, if you're a keen photographer, you think, well, what was that view like? Oh, here's the photograph. And what sort of flowers were those? Well, I photographed those. But your descriptions were so complete at times. And was that note taking or?
Yeah, it was generally note taking. I did take a lot of photos, but not even Ladakh could make me a great photographer, Tony, I'll tell you. So it really was. I took a lot of notes. I think I had 5 notebooks full of notes, yeah. And the other thing is, as I said, because it took me so long to write the book, because really the process of writing this book was really a process of understanding myself in a way. Myself.
You go back to your brother a lot through the book. I mean,
Oh,
he
yeah.
pops very regularly.
Yes, that is, and it's, that's a really important part of the book for me. I mean, it really is 50% of the story for me, and it is 100% of the catalyst for what brought me there. So, this book, I think, is very different than a lot of other Himalayan memoirs in that, it's not just about my interaction with people and place and religion and culture and flora and fauna, and all of those are in the book. But it's also about how the attitude, how, again, the compassion of Himalayan people had helped me understand this incredible trauma that I was completely blocked to. I didn't understand the really the severity of what my brother's death had done to me. It had blocked me in so many ways, and this walk really was like the release of the cork. I had all this energy, all this creative energy, and all this passion, and I needed something like this walk to start to release that. And I mean, and I have to give a lot of credit to the process of writing also. I mean, Tony, you do a lot of writing. You know that writing itself can be therapeutic. And in the process of writing this book, I wanted to, because so many incredible things happened along the walk. I always say that magic happened every day on this walk. And there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, you know from reading the book that these interactions with people, some of them, are straight out of fiction. It's really incredible. And for me, I wanted to be able to convey that magic on the page. And I remember, I went through the first draft. I went to Dharamsala, and I sat in a room there in Dharamsala for a couple of months and just started translating the notes and getting a first draft of this book done. And I remember finishing it and feeling really pretty happy with myself because I'd written a book. And then I went out and, having an Irish background, I had a few beers and a few whiskeys to celebrate.
Hello?
I went back
Hello?
to... Hello.
I totally lost you there. You're frozen.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me, though?
Yeah, you were starting to say you went to Dharamsala?
I went to Dharamsala, and I spent 2 months translating all of these notes into the first draft of this book. And when I'd finished that, of course, I was very proud of myself because I'd written a book, my first book, and I went off to celebrate with a few beers. And I came back a few days later to start editing this. And I remember reading the first couple of pages and going, "Oh my God, this is crap. No one is going to publish this, and no one is going to read this." Because what I'd actually written was a very, very poor imitation of a Lonely Planet guide to walking 2,700 kilometers across the Himalayas alone. And there's not a big market for that particular guidebook, Tony, as you can imagine. So it was that first draft was very much the process and logistics of doing this. And of course, it captured none of the magic that had actually occurred on the walk. So the goal became trying to capture that magic in some way. And I needed a lens. I needed to break into it and try and convey it. And first of all, I thought, well, I mean, it has to be the people, because, I've had such amazing interactions with Himalayan people for the past so many years. And so I did another draft talking about the culture of the Himalayas. That really didn't capture the magic of those meetings. And I thought, okay, well, maybe there's something about the flora and the fauna. Did that, another draft. It's getting there, but it's not quite there. So I thought it has to be religion. So I looking at Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. That's not quite there. So then I thought it's got to be spiritual landscape, which kind of encapsulates all of these different. And so what I was building there over 12 years was an extremely layered and and very comprehensive biography of the Himalayas. And as you said, there's a lot of very detailed description in there, and that's because I spent so much time researching that area, researching the people, researching the religions, but I still wasn't getting to where I needed to be. And the crux point in all of this was I was about, it would have been the early, no, probably the mid 2000s, 2004, 2005. I was in Kathmandu, living there, and a friend of mine was an editor, and she said, "Oh, hey, I'll read through your draft there and give you some feedback." And I thought, well, that's extremely generous of her. So she went off, read it. A couple of days later, we went out to dinner, and I remember coming in with the manuscript this big, and then a whole sheaf of notes on it. I thought, oh, that's fantastic. She's really been very generous with her time. And that sheaf of notes was, she had about 10 pages of notes in the first couple of pages of the book. So it ended up being a very in-depth edit that she was doing and critique. But at the bottom of it, what was happening was she was saying that there was something else going on in this book, and I wasn't tapping into it. There was another story underneath there, an undercurrent that I hadn't broken into yet. And I was kind of shaking my head and saying, "Oh, thank you very much. Yes, that could be it." But in the back of my mind, I was saying, she doesn't understand this. This is my walk about my Himalayas and my life. So much for all that Buddhist practice, Tony. completely ignoring her. And then, bizarrely enough, a couple of days later, I was in my hotel room in Kathmandu, and I was meditating. I do a lot of meditation in my writing practice, and I had just been editing the section of the book where I reached Galmuk. I reached the source of the Ganges, which was, one of the most incredible moments in my life, because when I arrived at Galmuk, it was just as the sun was setting behind Galmuk Glacier and the peaks there. And so the sky was, it was the color of rubies or coral. And then you get that glacial face of the ice there, and it was the color of turquoise. And I was alone. This was in November now, I think. So there was nobody there. It was well past pilgrimage season. So I'm alone walking into this incredible landscape. And I realized, of course, that turquoise and coral are the protective stones that every Tibetan child receives when they're born. So I thought, wow, it's almost like I'm moving into a landscape of protection. And I started running up the glacial moraine towards the actual source of the river. And I got there, and I don't know if you've been to Galmuk, but the Ganges actually emanates from a cave, from a glacial cave at the base of the glacier. And I arrived there, and the river comes out of there with force. It's not a trickle, it's a real river. And I sat down beside it on this gray sand beach. The sun had set down, and I just wanted to, it was so overwhelming. I just wanted to be there, be with it. And so I just stilled my breath, and I sat there quietly, and then I felt this heat rising up my spine, and I started crying. And I'd always thought that welling up of emotion was really related to the fact that I was at this incredible piece of sacred geography. I was at the source of the river that defines in so many ways. And then years later, a decade later, I'm sitting in Kathmandu in a hotel room, meditating on the same thing again. And I had this overwhelming sense of deja vu. I had been there before. And there was something about the light, that half light that you get just as the sun goes down in the mountains. And that coolness, it was probably, it was close to 0 degrees. And there wasn't a breath of wind. It was completely still. It was 4,500 meters up in the Himalayas. And I realized in this flash that the last time I'd been in that same type of environment was when I'd been in the hospital morgue in Canada and seen my brother's body dead, lying there before me. And when I made that connection between the two, then it was like a rainbow explosion because I realized that what the hell was I thinking about? Of course, the reason that I spent 8 years in the Himalayas and the reason why I walked 2,700 kilometers alone across the Himalayas was because I was trying to understand my brother's death. I was trying to put it into context. And the reason, of course, that I'd felt so amazing when I reached the Mahakali River was because that had been loosened up. But it took me years then of self-therapy through writing to realize that actually this story wasn't just about a 2,700 kilometer walk across the Himalayas. It was about that universal story that all of us have to encounter in this life, which is coming to terms with the death of a loved one. And when I realized that, then I went back to the text again and I rewrote the whole book again. And so many of those magic interactions that I had with people right across the Himalayas related to times that I'd actually spent with Gareth. And that's why, as you said, Tony, Gareth shows up again and again in this book, and it's because he was there. He was there with me all that time.
Yeah. So the book, 12 years of writing, it wasn't the book you started out to write.
Oh.
But did you start the trip thinking I'm going to write a book, or did the book emerge after the trip?
No,
You all along.
definitely my intention was to write a book.
Yeah.
If I'd known at that point how difficult it is to get a book published and how difficult it is to write a good book, I maybe would have gone into it with such high hopes and expectations. But at the same time, especially in the past year that the book has been so successful in India, the place where it was developed and the place where it really gelled, I just feel so. I'm just joyful. I'm so joyful that so many Indian people have picked up the book and read it and have come back to me and commented on it, and it's been a beautiful, beautiful thing. Oh my, great.
But it wasn't all sunlight. You had that uncomfortable time with the kids throwing. It seems to me, if at some point in your travel lives people don't throw stones at you, you haven't walked far enough. But it's not a good thing.
No, that was very confronting, actually. Because I've spent much of this talk here talking about the incredible generosity and compassion of people right across the Himalayas, and then there was a group of kids who decided that I would be a great target for them to throw stones at. I was a manifestation of Tom Alter. Tom Alter was the great Bollywood star who as the Hollywood movies. And here Tom Alter had walked into the village for them, and it was a chance for them to wreak havoc on the white ghosts. So yeah, it was also very interesting though, if you remember, Tony, when they throw the stones, I pretended that they killed me so that they'd hit me in the head. And I lay on the ground, and they all kind of stopped. They froze, and they're staring at the body there a couple of hundred meters down the road from them. And then they all ran because they could just imagine.
Yeah, real life Bollywood there. Look, we're going to be talking with Gary Weir as well during this, as part of this festival. So I think we should talk at some point. I don't want to necessarily do it now, about where we're walking right now in the pandemic, since we aren't. I mean, that option of heading out and doing a 2,700 kilometer walk, it ain't open right now.
No. But, don't get me going, Tony, because I can talk a long time about the magic and creativity of walking even out your back gate, right?
Yeah.
I know. And the truth is, of course, I go walking and running every day out my back gate here in Canberra, and I've been amazed at how many more people are out walking now. Now, you've been trapped in Melbourne, in a severe lockdown for a very long period of time. But in Canberra and Sydney and Perth and, up in London and across the US, people were able to get out. And the one activity that people seem to be falling back on, of course, is our simplest locomotion. More
Yeah.
and more people are out walking. And you've seen that. I mean, I've seen that because, I'm really a researcher into psychological benefits of walking. And there's so much more writing in the mainstream media about walking and how to do it and where to do it, and what you need to bring to it over the past 6 months. So that's been very encouraging for me. But at the same time, of course, I had been scheduled to take a trip to Bhutan next year, a walking tour there. And of course, that's not going to happen. And, I was hoping to get back to Ladakh either next year or the year after. I don't think that's going to happen either. So, yes, the pandemic has definitely changed our lives in lots of different ways.
Sure has. As you say, I wish we could carry on, but it's, distilling 4.5 months and 2,700 kilometers down to 40 minutes is not an easy job. But you've done it's been an interesting 40-minute walk. I've really learned a few more things. I'm going to go back and look at some elements of that book again with interest. Good to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Tony. And thanks so much to Ladakh Literature Festival. And I want to say a personal thanks to so many of my friends in Ladakh, especially to my Nono Puntsak, especially to my Amalay at the Delek's Guest House, to Nurbu and Namgyal who've worked with me in world expeditions there and trekked over many years. Thank you so much. It's been a great, great pleasure.
Thank you from me as well. Namaste.